All right, welcome everybody. This is the National Governors Associations and ORR briefing on the Economic Development Administration's American Rescue Plan funds for travel, tourism, and recreation. And this is a briefing just for NGA's Outdoor Recreation Learning Network. So welcome everybody. I just wanted to let everybody know that we will be having a presentation by EDA first by Shelby Wenner, who's a programs operation coordinator in the Office of Regional Affairs, and by Francis Sakaguchi, the Economic Development Integrator. And then the EDA's counsel, Ryan Survey, will be answering some of the questions we sent ahead of time. And then we're going to be opening it up for Q&A. I also wanted to mention for the Q&A period, I'd like you to go down to the reactions tab there, that little smiley face, click on that and raise your hand, and we will let you ask your own questions. I wanted to, make this interactive and allow you to have a follow-up, so you've got your questions thoroughly asked and answered. Also wanted to introduce Chris Perkins from ORR. They've been really hard at work for many months getting this funding in the recovery plan and shaping how it's spent and making a lot of good recommendations there. Chris, did you want to mention the recommendations you made, or the letter that you all just sent and the work that you've done on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bevan. It's great to be on the call, and we're very excited to support the work of the Learning Network and NGA. And for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Chris Perkins with Outdoor Recreation Roundtable. We're America's leading coalition of outdoor recreation trade associations and organizations who work to promote the growth of the outdoor recreation economy and outdoor recreation activities. And like Bevan mentioned, we're particularly excited about this opportunity as we've been working quite hard to educate Congress and the administration on the need for funding opportunities like these, especially in the wake of the pandemic and its effect on communities around the country. And in June, we wrote a letter to the EDA alongside 42 outdoor recreation and conservation organizations to advocate for outdoor recreation economies in the next round of EDA funding. And now that this $750 million opportunity has been designated for travel and tourism and outdoor recreation, we're quite excited to work with both federal, state, and local partners, the recreation and conservation community. And one thing I'll just flag before we hop into the call is the ORR Rural Economic Development Toolkit that we produced over the last year, and I'll throw a link in the chat. This is a set of best practices for economic development informed by interviews with over 60 practitioners, including many on this call. So big thanks, Bevan, to you, NGA, and also to the EDA for making this support available, and for the 3 EDA representatives joining this call. And we're excited for a fruitful discussion today.
Bevan, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, still getting used to Zoom. But we just put the ORR statement on the EDA funding opportunity in the chat. So just go ahead and get that out of the chat, and we can send it to the network afterwards as well. But let me turn it over now to Shelby Wenner. And Shelby, are you ready to give the presentation? And
yep.
Slides.
Let me share my screen.
Great.
All right, so thank you so much for having us this afternoon. I'm Shelby Wenner. As Bevan mentioned, I work in the Office of Regional Affairs in the headquarters office with EDA. Francis is also here with us, and she works out of the Seattle office. Francis, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself a little bit more.
Let me get off of mute here. So yeah, hi everybody. So I'm Francis Sakaguchi, and I am what they call the Economic Development Integrator out of the Seattle Regional Office, which is the 8 Western states, and it includes the Pacific Island. I'm real excited about this, our ARPA funding, and particularly in this sector as well, because I do have a background in this sector. So hopefully, we'll see a lot of really wonderful, impactful type of projects come out of this. So thank you for giving us the opportunity.
So Francis, I was thinking I could give a little bit of the rundown of EDA's mission, some of the more general stuff, and then pass it on to you for the travel and tourism and outdoor recreation piece. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with Economic Development Administration, this is our mission up here to lead federal economic development, promoting innovation and competitiveness, and preparing American regions for growth and success. We really consider ourselves a bottom-up, community-led economic development agency, and our biggest goal is to help communities develop resilient and agile local economies. Every once in a while, EDA gets a fresh new set of investment priorities or revisited set of investment priorities, and this is our current list. Topping the list for the first time is equity. So EDA is really committed to equity as an investment priority in our ARPA funding and otherwise. Additionally, recovery and resilience is an investment priority for all of the funding that we have, and is something that will need to be demonstrated for all of our American Rescue Plan funding as well. In addition, we have workforce development, manufacturing, technology-based economic development, environmentally sustainable development, and exports and foreign direct investment as investment priorities as well. More specifically about American Rescue Plan, as I'm sure you all know by now, we received $3 billion in supplemental funding to invest in communities across the US, again, in this bottom-up economic development manner. We're focused on advancing equity, creating good-paying jobs, helping workers to develop in-demand skills, building economic resilience, and accelerating the economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. We are committed to building back better from this pandemic, and travel and tourism is one of 6 programs that we've designed and put out there to do so, and that'll be the focus, obviously, of today. A quick rundown of the other 5 programs and our additional funding commitment. We're really thinking about these in three unique buckets of impact. So for creating jobs for today is really where we're thinking about travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation funding, as well as our Good Jobs Challenge, a workforce development program. We're also committed to communities built for all. So our traditional economic adjustment assistance program falls under this category, as well as funding for Indigenous communities specifically, and a $300 million coal communities commitment that will go to revitalize coal communities. And finally, programs that will develop regions for the future. Our Build Back Better Regional Challenge is a unique sort of industry cluster program designed to create, support, build industry clusters for the future, as well as our statewide planning, research, and networks program. Francis, do you want to take it from here, or should I? I think you're on mute.
There we go. I think that would work. And normally I've got a bunch of dogs in the background, and Shelby has seen them, and I put them downstairs too, so they'll be quiet. So, but if you hear some muffled barking, that's them. But of this $3 billion that EDA has received for ARPA, 25% of that has been set aside for the travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, which is the $750 million. And of that $750 million, this has been divided up into 2 separate grant programs. The 510 million of that 750 is a program set aside for our states and territories. So it's direct allocation to states and territories, and it is at 100% non-competitive federal share. I think there's a slide that kind of goes into a little more detail on that. And then there's $240 million that is set aside, and that's the competitive side of this travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation grant. And the competitive grants to fund in regions most affected by damage to the sector from the coronavirus pandemic. So Shelby, I think you're going to be the one that's going to be shifting the slides for me. So I guess I got to tell you on that. And just to finish up on the competitive side, that one is it's not 100%. It is for the most part 80% grant funding and 20% match. There is some possibilities of adjusting that. And it is more competitive if you have a match. So just a little background on that. So speaking of the state non-competitive side of the grant, the $510 million worth. So this is to assist communities all around each state suffered economic injury because of job losses in the travel, tourism, or outdoor rec sector. It is by invitation letters sent to the governor. And it's going to be up to the governor's office to determine how that funding is allocated and who would manage that within the state, or who they will designate on that. The governors are required to apply within 60 days of receiving the EDA invitation, and then the states can spend awards either they're within the state on their own, or they can subaward that to another organization within the state. Next slide, please. These are some of the eligible uses of that non-competitive funding. And there is a lot of crossover in terms of eligible uses between this and the competitive funding as well, but this is on the non-competitive side. So again, supporting travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation sectors, and then consistent with the CDC guidelines on safe travel. These are just some examples, they're not all of them. Tourism, marketing, promotion, workforce training and development. I think you've noticed that was one of our priorities as well. Economic development planning, coordination, strategy development can fall under there, technical assistance projects. And that's pretty flexible. I heard some ideas being thrown around prior to this starting, and so that might fit underneath there. The physical part of this funding would be upgrade and retrofits to existing travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation infrastructure, as well as new infrastructure type of projects that can support these activities. And so those can include, upgrades, whether it's facility upgrades, various types of infrastructure upgrades. There's ADA. There's a lot of different things that can fall under that. There's a note here in terms of the physical part might require additional environmental review. Everything is going to require environmental review, whether it is infrastructure or not. It's just that those that don't have any type of ground moving and things that would require further review can get by as a categorical exclusion, and those that do have things that are more physical that may impact natural resources, it may impact air quality, there might be a SHPL issue for historic preservation. Those would require further, they will require further environmental review. And this is a short turnaround, so that those things should be considered on these types of projects, submittals. Next slide, please. Here's the timeline on the non-competitive side. The invitations have been sent out already from EDA to the state and the territories. Hopefully, most of them have received these invitations by now, and this is invitations to apply for the non-competitive side of the funding. We are allowing 60 days after the invitations to get the applications in. The anticipation is that EDA will award no later than November, and then May 31st, 2027 is the last day to incur costs. So that is, you've got that long to be able to get projects developed, and when we say incur costs, there is a hard deadline of September 30th, 2027 to get all the funds dispersed. So that's the reason of having this May 31st, 2027 day to incur costs. Submittal, that's what we mean by that. By incur, we mean by submittal. Next slide, please. On the competitive side of the travel, tourism, and outdoor rec, that's $240 million. And again, they can fund non-construction and construction activities, pretty similar to the type of activities that we see in the non-competitive side, but we don't want any kind of duplication here. So this funding is intended to fund projects. You can support development and implementation of a community's economic development strategy, travel, tourism, outdoor recreation as part of the pandemic recovery. You can fund projects that are in regions that are most adversely affected by damage or being impacted in this sector from the coronavirus. And we know there's been a big consumer change and a big increase of people recreating and traveling locally, and so we know there's a lot of impacts there and a lot of opportunities there as well. The applicants must notify EDA in the application if they're seeking or receiving any other funding for this project. So no duplication with either the state funding on the non-competitive side or on some of the other EDA funding pots as well. And when it says that EDA will use a regular IRC process to evaluate these competitive projects, what that means, IRC stands for Investment Review Committee, and it is within each region, there is a review committee that reviews the application, and then based on the merit of the application and the completeness of the application and the impacts, they will go ahead and recommend the project up to the regional director for final decision. Okay, next slide, please. These are the eligible applicants for the competitive tourism grants. This is pretty standard with some of our other funding pockets as well. So a district organization, which is an economic development district, they are eligible. For those who don't know what that is, it is a geographic organization of 2 counties or more that EDA has designated to do economic development work. And there are economic development districts all over the country, but in the western states, there aren't as many. There are some states that maybe have one. There are parts of at least I cover the western states, so I'm familiar with this. There are some areas that do not have EDDs, but just note that they are eligible. And another plus of working with an EDD is that they are required to have a SED, which is a comprehensive economic development strategy. That's basically a long-range planning document that EDA uses. And so if you are working, if your project's within an area that there is an EDD, it's really good because then you can also refer to the SEDs and when you work with the EDD. Tribes are another eligible applicant. Tribes are also typically federal recognized tribes eligible up to 100% of our funding. State, county, city, local agencies, political subdivisions of the state, special purpose unit, that's something like a PUD. They're also eligible. Institutes of higher education or consortia of higher eds is eligible, and public or private nonprofit organizations. And that's the 501c3s, most of the 501c6s as well. And when we say acting in cooperation with the officials of a political subdivision of a state, when a nonprofit would submit an application, we would want some kind of coordination on the economic development efforts of the local area, whether it's city, county, the state. And so having that kind of support whether it's in a support letter or some type of coordination, that's what we mean by acting in cooperation. EDA is not authorized. We cannot fund directly to individuals, private businesses, or for-profit entities. Okay, next slide. These are the deadlines for the competitive grant. It's open now. Applications can be, it's open. The NoFO's out now, and we can start accepting applications. And the short turnaround, when they say September 30th, 2022, all funds obligated, that means that the application's got to come in, EDA has to process, and EDA has to get awarded within that time frame. And the difficulty when you start thinking about projects there, if there are projects where there's going to be a lot more coordination on your end, that's going to have environmental requirements due to NEPA. So whether that is consultations, BOs, the permitting, those kind of things, keep that in mind because of this really short turnaround, this short deadline on that. If awarded, you will have up to 5 years to get the project completed and funds dispersed, which is a September 30th deadline. But to be able to do that, we've got to May 31st, 2027. Excuse me. Excuse me. Okay. Eligible uses of this tourism grant. I mentioned strategies earlier, planning strategy development for the travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation pandemic recovery. Strategies are really flexible. So really do think, you could, there's traditional, and think a little bit outside the box in terms of some of your partnerships as well, because there's some really great opportunities here. Recovery project implementation. So these are more of the physical type of projects, the construction type of projects. Again, these are just some examples. Culture, arts, and tourism facilities. That would include such things as interpretive centers as well. This is a change for EDA, support of either development or improvements, zoos and aquariums, new outdoor recreation and trail infrastructure, public access enhancements, and nature-based infrastructure projects to improve access to recreation. That is, there's a lot of possibilities there. And then we've got the non-constructive activities, which includes countrywide and multi-state travel, tourism, or outdoor recreation promotion. So when I think of those, I often think of corridors, the larger connectivity type of projects. But there are, again, these can vary quite a bit. So state and local tourism promotion and marketing projects are only eligible under state tourism grants. So those are the ones, the non-competitive state and local level tourism promotion and marketing, those fall under the non-competitive funding. Then we've got diversification projects here. So these are projects that may not always be under you would think as travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, but it really helps diversify the economy. So that is, again, a lot of collaboration and thinking a little broader on what these funds can support. Next slide, please. Okay, these are steps to apply. The access to the NoFO, and I think most of you probably have seen that, but here's a link. It's under grants.gov. And you do want to read the NoFO. There's a lot of information there. It's not the easiest thing to read, but there's a lot of information there. And actually within grants.gov, to access the NoFO, you'll want to go to related documents. So that's where you can access that. And you can apply directly through grants.gov, and you'll see a little apply link there when you get to that. If you have an economic development district in your area, definitely look them up. Here's a link to that. And then EDA has what they call EDRs, or economic development representatives. These are the field reps. We have one or more in each state, and they are literally on the ground, and they can help you with projects and with the application, project development and application. And the link here is to where you can find the EDR in your state. And then we've got an inbox for questions. So there's a link to that. And the map here shows our various regions and the states within that. And then I think, okay, questions. Now I think, Ryan, this is going to be your end, right?
Yeah.
Francis, can I just ask
Thank
you
you,
a
Francis.
few questions that came up in my mind during your presentation? And the state pot of money, the 510 million, can that be used to acquire land for parks, like land acquisition?
Oh boy, Ryan, I'm going to let you answer that because I know EDA has not always been. I mean, LWCF is great for land acquisition, but.
That is also one we're prepped to cover in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. All right. And then another just administrative question. You mentioned the competitive grants, the 240 million, and that is directed toward regions most affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Do you have a map of those regions? And is that the highest priority, and then the other regions can apply as well?
Well, if pandemic affected everyone. I mean,
right.
Yeah. So nationwide, everyone is under this disaster declaration.
Okay. Good to know.
But in terms of competitiveness, I think that's where you can, in your narrative, in your application, you can really say this is how you've been impacted. So that's kind of what I think we're talking about here.
Okay. All right. Well, let's proceed with the questions that are on the screen then. Thanks, Ryan.
Sounds great. Thanks, Francis. Just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Ryan Survey. I'm counsel at EDA. And thank you, Bevan and Chris. Appreciate being able to speak to this group. Diving into the questions, I want to make one point at the top. The answers to some of these questions are going to turn on whether it's a non-competitive award or a competitive award. So I just want to, reiterate what Shelby and Francis covered, that there's $510 million set aside in non-competitive awards to states, and then $240 million in competitive awards. So jumping in, the first one is going to be, can grant money be spent on federal land infrastructure projects? The NoFO mentions national parks, but not USFS, BLM, et cetera. So the NoFO covers, so I'm going to talk first, actually this is going to be, I think, applicable to both competitive and non-competitive awards. And eligible activities under the NoFO include projects that enhance public access to outdoor recreational opportunities. So that could be enhancing public access to federal land, be it a national park, but also a state park. So it doesn't have to be enhancing access to federal land. It can be state too. However, I'll talk about this more in a little bit, but for construction projects, which I imagine this is what this question contemplates, it's going to be important that the recipient of the federal funds either has title or some sort of long-term right to use the property. And so in the case of like BLM, for instance, that might not be possible. And so you're going to hear me say this a lot, but if you have specific questions about a specific project, we really encourage you to reach out to the economic development representative that covers your state or region. EDA has an economic development representative for every state or region. And on that contact list that was on the prior slide that Francis had up, that'll list the economic development representative. So again, if you have specific questions about a specific project, it's really, really, I think, going to be useful for you all to reach out to that economic development representative. They're based in the states that they serve, and they tend to know them very, very well. So again, projects that enhance access or provide infrastructure for natural outdoor recreational opportunities are okay, and there's no requirement that it be federal land or non-federal land, but title and having a right to build on the property is going to be important, and that's going to be, I think, a major consideration for folks looking to do construction on federal lands. So I'm going to move to the next question, and that is, what are matching fund requirements? So there is going to be a different answer for the state non-competitive tourism grants and the competitive tourism grants. The state non-competitive tourism grants EDA will make awards at 100% federal grant rate. So there's no matching share required. In contrast, for the competitive awards, there's an 80% grant rate in most circumstances. However, in some very special circumstances, EDA has the ability to go up to a 100% and waive the match requirement. If you are interested in pursuing that, going from 80 to 100, that's one of the things that we'd recommend that you talk to your local economic development representative about, because it's really going to turn on the specific circumstances of your region. Going to the next, how long beyond receiving the funding will entities have to spend it? Great question, but kind of a nuanced question, but I'm going to do my best to make it as general as possible. So typically, economic recovery grants, EDA makes for 12 to 24 month periods. However, under the travel and tourism funding opportunity, there is a really broad range of activities that can be funded, including construction activities, and it would be very difficult to knock out a construction project in 24 months. So the term of the awards is really going to turn on the exact activities that are contemplated under the award. I think that EDA is looking for the initial term to be 48 months or less. That's not a hard requirement, but that's, I think, going to be most likely with the cases. And then EDA has a hard congressional deadline to expend all funds by September 30th, 2027. So we could not reimburse any expenditures that occurred after that date. And I think Frances highlighted that earlier in her presentation. So to recap, it's the term of the awards that EDA will make under this travel and tourism outdoor recreation NoFO the term is going to depend on the exact activities funded, but there's an absolute deadline for EDA of September 30th, 2027. Next, are there NEPA and NHPA? So if anybody doesn't know, that's the National Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. Are there NEPA and NHPA compliance requirements? And if so, will costs associated with that compliance be eligible through these grants? So first, I think Frances covered this, but I'll reiterate that it really depends on whether they're construction or non-construction activities. For the vast majority, I'm going to go ahead and say all non-construction activities, there is not going to be NEPA and NHPA compliance. For construction activities, there will be, but the extent of the compliance activities are really going to turn on exactly what that construction project is. So if it's renovating an existing facility, the NEPA and NHPA requirements are likely to be very low. If it's new construction in wetlands, you can bet there will be, that the NEPA process will take time. And so I'm glad this question is here, because that's one thing for folks to keep in mind, that September 30th, 2027 is a fair bit away, but if there's going to be significant environmental compliance requirements for a project and architectural work, and then complex building work, that all takes time, and September 30th, 2027 could arrive quicker than it feels like it would. So that is something to keep in mind, that new construction in environmentally sensitive areas might be difficult to accomplish that within the congressionally mandated deadline of September 30th, 2027. And then next, will costs associated with that compliance be eligible through these grants? That depends. Likely, yes. In many cases, yes. But that's going to depend on the circumstances of the project. If you have questions about that, that's a good one to reach out to EDA about, because it will turn in part on your project. But oftentimes, those are eligible costs. And I think I maybe heard somebody chime in, so I'm just going to create some space for that for a second.
Oh, sorry, Ryan, that was me. It was Bevan, and I just saw that very question in the chat box, but you just addressed it, so thanks. So go ahead.
Great, thanks. All right, so moving forward, will long-term program and management planning efforts be eligible for funding? Yes. So I actually am going to read some language directly from the NoFO here, and it is short-term and long-term economic development planning and coordination to respond to the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. The regional travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation industry are eligible. So yes. Next, will land acquisition be allowable? So it really depends. So land acquisition is an eligible cost. Whether a project is allowable, it depends on the project. So it depends in part what the land will be acquired to be used, but land acquisition is an eligible cost. And Bevan, did you have a follow-up question on that I maybe saw in the chat?
Sorry, I don't see, well, let's see. There was a question about the environmental reviews. Do they need to be conducted within the 60 days, or can some of the grant funding be used towards compliance? So no, I didn't see about
thank you.
land acquisition.
Okay, so thanks for flagging that. Going back to environmental compliance, so that 60-day window is only for the non-competitive state awards, right? It doesn't, that 60-day window doesn't carry over to the competitive awards. So on the non-competitive statewide awards, no, we do not expect, I think it'd be impossible. We don't expect you to go through all the environmental compliance requirements during that 60-day window. We would expect that to happen during the post-award period, so after the award is made, which is a little atypical for EDA. Generally, that's something that happens beforehand, but EDA would basically be approving that during the period of the award. And I see a chat question coming in. Will inclusion of outdoor recreation infrastructure projects in grant applications for the competitive grants be part of the scoring criteria? And if so, can you provide details? I'm going to think on that and get back to you. It's just, I just need a second to digest that question. So I'm going to bounce back to the questions on the screen. Will these grants pay for increased staff needed to operate new areas that are opening up to alleviate the crowded conditions due to the increase in tourism and visitation at parks and recreation areas? So I'm going to answer that in two parts. The first is that eligible costs under this funding opportunity include personnel costs. So staff costs are eligible. However, EDA is really looking to fund projects that benefit the outdoor, the travel, tourism, outdoor recreation industry. And so an eligible cost under this funding opportunity would not include the general costs of government or supplementing governmental operating budgets. So I'm not certain what this question is getting to, but to the extent it's asking, whether EDA funding could be used to say pay like for a state park ranger, the answer would be no, because EDA is not supplementing state budgets. However, conceivably there could be personnel costs that EDA would fund on an economic development project that benefits the travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation industry. And I know that's a fine line, but I think maybe the important thing to keep in mind is that EDA is not funding the general cost of government or supplementing government budgets. If the person who asked that question is on the call, I'd be really interested to know if I addressed that question.
Hey, this is Ricky Geese from Alaska. Let me give you an example on that. So we have a design and construction section within state parks that does design and construction, but we don't have planners. Would we be allowed to, and we have conceptual ideas, but they're not shovel ready and they have to go through a permitting process. Would this grant allow us to hire a planner on a temporary non-permanent basis for like 3 years to get a lot of our conceptual projects to the shovel ready stage?
Very likely, yes. So personnel costs to pay for like the planning or implementation of projects under this funding opportunity would very likely be eligible for award. And if you're wondering, the reason I say very likely is just because sometimes there could be like weird specifics of a project, but I can't think of any right now. I think that would be an eligible use of funds under this funding opportunity.
All right, thanks.
Ryan,
I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can open it up for, I know there have been a couple questions in the chat. And then
Yeah, just go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question and we can call you in order.
I have a quick question, Ryan. And apologies if this hasn't been answered, or if this has been answered already. Those of us in the outdoor rec sphere are delighted to see outdoor rec designated in this NoFO. I think all of us also recognize that outdoor recreation would fit into other categories in this $3 billion in funding, whether it be good jobs, indigenous communities, coal communities, build back better. Is there any disadvantage to applying for more than one funding opportunity? Is that something that grant applicants can do?
Brian, do you want me to take this one?
I would love it. Thank you, Shelby.
Sure. So Chris, thanks for asking that. I think the key to remember is an organization can apply to multiple programs with different projects, but we do not want anyone to apply or submit the same project to different NoFOs. So if an organization has the ideas, the capacity to create multiple applications for different projects, that's exciting and great. We just really don't want the same project to end up in multiple locations.
Shelby, if one grant pot of money gets a project and they say, oh, this really fits better in that one, will they just send it over there and notify the applicant?
Yeah, so the regional offices do have the ability to shift projects or applications if necessary. We're really hoping that before that happens, the applicant connects with their economic development representative in their state, and that economic representative can actually guide them into the right place or the best place to be most competitive to start with.
Carol Ann, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. So just a quick question as to whether or not an eligible program would be the creation of an outdoor recreation infrastructure grant program administered by an Office of Outdoor Recreation. So currently, Maine, we don't have one. And I'm just looking at the sub-awards, and I want to make sure that if we try to do that to fund a number of smaller projects, if that's a possibility.
So sub-awards are permissible under this program, and that would be both in the statewide non-competitive awards and the competitive awards. It's permissible sub-award. May I ask, what sorts of activities are you contemplating that such a grant program might fund?
So we've got a number of trail projects that are sort of in the works, and we're also have a very strong destination development program. So in those communities in which we're doing destination development work, everything from kiosks to wayfinding to actual trail surface, resurfacing and or extensions into Main Street communities would be the types of things. But there's a lot of them. So we were thinking it'd be better to set up a program that they could then apply to us competitively.
Got it. Thanks for sharing. That sounds really exciting. And yes, those activities sound permissible under the NoFO, the funding opportunity. And one thing that I would, two things that I would stress. One, that any sub-awards, any awards that are sub-awarded down, the activities would have to be eligible under the funding opportunity. And based on what you just said, it sounds like those activities would be. And then second, that any entity that received funding pursuant to a sub-award would have to be an eligible entity. And I'm going to actually tack on a third one, and that is that sub-awards have to be competitively let. So folks would have to have more, EDA doesn't mandate like a specific competition process or something, but folks would have to have an equal opportunity to compete for such awards. Does that answer your question?
That's great. Thank you so much.
All right, great. Thanks, Carol Ann. I see John Snyder's next. Go ahead, John, ask your question.
Yeah, I have a question about the competitive funds. I seem, if I'm getting this correct, they're meant for regions that are most impacted by the tourism downturn. In my state, however, though, we have probably two situations that are a variance on this. One, the places that we need help right now were not affected by the downturn. They were actually slammed by COVID, not we need projects in places that are way past carrying capacity for our public lands. I don't know if that makes them hard to be eligible for this funding source. And the second one is we have lots of places that were affected by COVID, but they are more affected by 2 bad wildfire seasons in a row. So the primary depression of tourism is more wildfire than it is COVID. Do either of those two variations make it hard to use the competitive grants?
So great question. Thanks for asking. On the competitive side, as Francis had mentioned, all the country is eligible, but then some, applications from some regions might be more competitive than applications from other regions. And definitely the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic is a factor in competitiveness, but so is the overall economic distress of the region. And so I think that what I heard you say is that maybe there are some highly distressed regions that weren't severely impacted by the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic. And so it's likely that it's very possible that such a project could still be competitive because of the overall economic distress of the region, even if the actual impact of the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic was fairly light. If you haven't, I'd invite you to take a look at the funding opportunity, and I think it was linked in the chat. And I'll say that section E1, page 25, lists about a dozen competitiveness factors. And so the extent that the project was impacted by the coronavirus pandemic is one, but the factors are equally weighted, and there are several there. So it may well be that the project and the region actually check several boxes, and that it's a competitive project. Jen, did that answer your question? Great.
Why don't we get Mary, and then I see Lee's hand up as well.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I went to an earlier EDA presentation last week, but I appreciate this is specific to outdoor recreation. My question is about non-infrastructure that supports access to outdoor recreation. We've been looking at an outdoor recreation asset map for the state. I'd like to know if that's eligible. And then my second question is, EDA seems to support regional projects. Do we need to reach out beyond our community or state to be more competitive? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Great questions. I'm going to take them in turn. The first is, on the asset mapping, non-construction activities are certainly eligible, and in some ways they're simpler to implement, although infrastructure activities and construction activities are certainly eligible. Asset mapping should be eligible. So that, I think, falls under planning, and I think that is something that EDA would fund under this funding opportunity. And actually, let me just be a little firmer. Asset mapping is something that EDA would fund under this funding opportunity. Moving on to regions, it's really going to depend on the project. There's no hard requirement that if a city or a county or a small nonprofit is applying for funding under this funding opportunity, there's no hard requirement that that eligible entity reach out and apply or coordinate with the region or a larger like a group of states. However, I think that competitive applications often do take account for what are the needs of the region and how what partnerships are in place because I think a competitive application, we're looking for something that's going to be sustainable and have both short and long-term impact. And so I think that regional partners and things like that can really help along those lines, but there's no hard coordination requirement. And as far as reaching out across state lines, no, many projects that EDA funds will benefit a region, but that might be a metropolitan region or something like that. There's no requirement to reach out across states. I know that you mentioned, Mary, that you had attended another EDA webinar that wasn't specific to tourism. And there is another competition called EDA's Build Back Better Regional Challenge that involves where applications have to involve a number of projects over a region, and often those regions will cross state lines. So it's possible that that discussion maybe got sort of it was specific to the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, but maybe got sort of blended in with some of the travel and tourism stuff. But I guess to answer your question again more directly, there's no hard requirement to coordinate across state lines or within a broader region. Francis, I bet you deal with this issue a lot as an integrator. Do you have anything that you'd add from a programmatic perspective to what I just said?
Thank you, Ryan.
No, I think what you said is really good. I mean, there is, especially like in the outdoor recreation type sector in that, there are, I mentioned trails or scenic byways or some of these corridors, and I know there are corridor management plans that are set up and they go across state, and a lot of them hit multiple communities, and these are set up for economic development type efforts, but that would be you don't have to do that, but there are opportunities looking at that and the various, and we have a cluster map somewhere. I think about it. We've got some cluster map information, but you can see some of the connections there if you just look at some of those and think of possibilities. But it requires a lot more coordination, and again, with the short turnaround time, unless something is already in the works in terms of a strategy, in terms of planning, it may be tough, but I wish we had more time with some of this funding, because I can this is really exciting to see the possibilities here.
Can I just clarify, for the mapping project, do I need a match? Is it competitive or not competitive?
So
Go ahead.
Sorry, Francis, I didn't mean to jump in. On the match, it would depend on less on the activities and more on the entity. So is it your state that would be doing the mapping, or is it a different entity that you would potentially apply as?
The state would apply, and the entity doing it would be a mapping specialist.
So in as much as it's the state, it would probably be under the non-competitive award. It's certainly eligible under the non-competitive awards. And that's at 100% grant rate, so there would not be a matching requirement. The mapping would, I imagine, it would be an outside contractor that would do it. If they're hiring it, if the state were hiring somebody to do it, those would be personnel costs that would be allowable. If they are contracting with an outside contractor, that's fine. But the state would just have to follow its typical procurement requirements.
Great, thank you so much.
Those mapping type projects, those are considered the technical assistant type of project. So, really, really good stuff.
Great. I know Lee has had his hand up, and then we have another question in the chat, maybe to wrap up.
Whoopsie. Okay, I'm Lee.
Hi, Lee.
And thank you again to all of you for having. I appreciate that there is this outdoor recreation focused presentation for this grant. So thank you for your time and willingness to take our questions as well. And so to rephrase the question I asked that kind of stumped the facilitator is, this is called the Tourism and Travel and Outdoor Recreation grant category. And so, are you expecting to receive like tourism grants and outdoor recreation grants? And to what degree might your scoring criteria, weight applications that marry both of those sectors together, where they're both collaborating to do that? Is there any particular, your scoring criteria, does it reward that type of behavior?
So a handful of things I'd like to share. The first is that, if you haven't already, I would definitely check out the funding opportunity, and section E1 has the competitiveness criteria, and that's on page 25. And I think that'll help provide a good flavor of what EDA is looking at. And I'll run through a few, but just at the top, I'll state that, it's not that EDA doesn't have like specific funding buckets or a certain amount of travel or tourism or outdoor recreation that we want to reach. It's, all of those projects are eligible, and, we don't have one that we want to see or that we necessarily want to see them all combined. But, it's possible that by combining activities, a project is more competitive, not by virtue of having those activities, but because it, responds to the needs of the region more comprehensively or something. So just to run through a few of the competitiveness criteria. One is the extent to which the region has suffered economic injury as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, specifically in the travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation sectors. And so just applied to your question, the project that you're coming in with, EDA is going to look at, like, how does this respond to the injury? And to the extent that, all three of those, travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation, were impacted, and this project, this hypothetical project, responds to all three of those, I think that would be, a good thing, and it would make the project more competitive, not because it marries those different activities together or those different industries together, but because it responds to the economic injury caused by the coronavirus pandemic. And so similarly, there's the degree of economic distress in the community, the project's feasibility, its sustainability, the applicant's organizational capacity. So those things, you can see how they might filter down into the exact activities contemplated, but there's no requirement that, an application, or there's no specific explicit criterion that requires or that would favor applications that address all of those sectors, all three of those sectors. Lee, does that address your question?
It does. Thank you very much.
Great.
Add as well, because you'll see in the NoFO, there's a section on resilience, and that's the one thing to keep in mind as well in terms of competitiveness. How does your project make the region more resilient, especially to these economic challenges that the pandemic has caused? But kind of keeping that in mind as well, because that's really, even though you're answering that, it's really providing the opportunity. Looking at opportunities, that's what that question is doing, and so kind of look at it in that sense.
So Francis, do you have an example of of prior projects that made areas more resilient? Just just to cite some example, what that would look like
In the outdoor rec sector, there's this one coal communities one actually in Colorado, which is a good example, but I don't have all the details on. Actually, Chris, you're familiar with that. Whoever's in Colorado, they're familiar with that one. Because I know we like using that as an example.
Well, Francis is thinking, I might just jump in and say that it is probably going to depend on the region and the state and the community, what is going to make that project and that work most resilient, or make that community more resilient. So again, I think I would, Francis may have a good example for a specific community, but I would definitely start those conversations with the representative in the state.
And we're talking economic resilience, not like resilience to climate change, right? Things like that. Or that,
yes,
unless the climate change made it more economically resilient. Okay.
Right.
It could be both. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, they're related. I mean, there's a lot of
Right.
relationships there.
Okay. Right.
When we were talking resilience, we're also talking about resilience to natural disaster. I mean, there are a lot of different pieces that may affect different regions and different places differently.
Right. So if a road keeps getting, wiped out by rainfall and things like that, then obviously you can't pursue, economic activity if people can't get there. So things like that. Okay, we have one more question in the chat. Is there a ceiling or floor on the amount for the state, the non-competitive grant?
Yeah, Chris did a great job kind of putting in an answer there.
Okay.
And did an explanation for us of our state grant administration formula. And then for the competitive tourism grants, on the other side of that, another example of the range. Honestly, it's a very wide range. I know this, Jackson, you're specifically asking about the state grants, but speaking of the competitive grants, it really is going to matter what the project is, what the community needs, that type of thing. But we have some general ranges in there.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any other last minute questions? We have time for about one more quick question. Oh, so I think Francis mentioned a cluster map. So could we get that cluster map from you? Because we wanted to send that to our.
Yeah, so that
was about the regional work that was being done.
I believe the URL is clustermapping.us. I'll drop it in the chat.
All right. And then one last question. You mentioned for the, I think it was the competitive grants, it is the competitive grants, where EDA is paying 80% and that has discretion to go to 100%. What types of things would they go to 100% for? Is it for equity or for underserved communities, or what's the criteria there?
Yeah, distress is the main driver there. And I will say, I think we mentioned this in the Q&A, but the more match that a project can demonstrate, the more competitive it is, with that exception for extreme distress.
Right. And the matches could also, they didn't have to be cash, they could be in-kind services and broad partnerships and things like that. Okay, we've been talking about partnerships a lot, especially with Land and Water Conservation Fund, increased funding. All right, well, thank you so much. I think if there's no further questions, we are at time, and I want to be respectful of your time and our members' time as well. So I just want to say we really, really appreciate all this information and answering all these detailed questions. And if we have any follow-up questions, I know you mentioned to our members to check with their regional EDA offices. So we will get that information, those links.
I just dropped a link to our contact page, which has the email addresses of every single economic development representative across the country. So feel free to connect with your specific EDR through that link. You can also, for more general questions, if you don't really know who to go to, you can always email travelandtourism@eda.gov.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Francis and Shelby and Ryan. And thanks a lot, Chris, for your expertise on this subject too. And we will end the webinar right now.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
I'm just going to grab the chat before we end.